Come on, hit me.
Stop it! My hot take is that this whole love triangle mess could have been avoided if Adam and Susanna parented the boys a little differently. Hey everyone, I'm Jacqueline. I'm an associate marriage and family therapist who loves shows and movies a little too much and definitely overanalyzes them through the lens of psychology. So follow along if you want to hear about how the sibling rivalry is a downfall of the Fisher boys. And yes, we will be covering both Jeremiah and Conrad. As a therapist, I've definitely seen the least amount of research being done about like sibling relationships, especially when compared to maybe like romantic relationships or like parental relationships, which I always thought was interesting given how important I feel like sibling relationships are in a child's development. Like the Fisher boys could definitely be in family therapy together for like a hot minute. So one of the biggest topics that are talked about when sibling relationships are discussed is how sibling rivalry impacts their relationship. And when sibling rivalry is left unchecked, it can definitely breed a lot of resentment, competitiveness, and low self-esteem for either or both individuals. I definitely think that there's this like weird dynamic where Conrad feels the need to be like this perfect child. He can never do really anything wrong and feels almost this like over responsibility to Jeremiah and even at times like maybe like Belly and Stephen. Where in contrast, Jeremiah always feels like he's living in his brother's shadow and can never live up to that standard. Obviously, both dynamics are harmful to Conrad and Jeremiah and their relationship, but I do think that as a viewer, it's a lot easier to maybe like empathize with Conrad a little bit because Jeremiah just comes off as like manipulative or like immature, especially in season 3. And you can't convince me that Jenny Han did not write his script to literally be memed on the internet.
You were the one who texted me to come over and take care of business. Pretty please. Pretty please. Because if I kiss you, I don't know that I can ever stop.
I think it's so interesting how the show makes it such a point to contrast Jeremiah and Conrad in multiple different ways, and sometimes neutrally, but honestly, most of the time in a very negative way, right? Like, Conrad's the brother that wants to go to med school. He's the responsible one. He's the one that bakes the muffins, not buys them. Whereas Jeremiah is the brother that is a super senior. He has no idea what he wants to do in life. And I think it's so painfully obvious that Conrad is favored by not just Adam, but Susanna too. Although I do feel like she's a little bit less explicit about it. Unsurprisingly, research suggests that differential treatment for siblings can result in negative consequences, such as lower self-esteem, behavioral problems, especially for those that are the less favored ones. Now, keep the behavioral problems and the lower self-esteem in mind while I explain a concept called the Rosenthal effect, which is more commonly known as the self-fulfilling prophecy. The Rosenthal effect is best explained by an experiment the researcher Rosenthal did with a bunch of school children. So he had them all take IQ tests in the beginning of the year, and he found that all these kids, they scored around the same, all pretty like average scores. However, he told the teachers that half of these kids, they perform extremely well and are gifted, and the other half, they're just like ordinary students. But keep in mind that all these students actually on average scored about the same. He just kind of randomly chose kids to be the gifted ones. And so what they found was that at the end of the year, when these kids took the exam again, the kids that were labeled the gifted ones were the ones that actually performed much better than their peers at the end of the year. If you take a look at this image, you can kind of better understand how this process is very cyclical and almost self-reinforcing. We can see very clear examples of how Belly, Adam, and Susanna treat Jeremiah very differently from the way that they treat Conrad. Okay, so take the volleyball tournament for example. I feel like in the beginning, Jeremiah and Belly are doing pretty well together. They're having a lot of fun. It's not until Jeremiah starts to struggle a little bit that Belly does not even hesitate to replace him with Conrad. And at that point, Jeremiah doesn't even need her to finish her sentence before he knows that he's about to be replaced by his older brother yet again.
I'm so sorry. I have to win this, okay? They'll match my pledges.
Yeah, I get it.
And I know this is a very trivial example, but I think it really goes to show how little people expect of Jeremiah and how he oftentimes doesn't get the chance to be challenged or rise to the occasion, which then reinforces his idea that he's never going to be as good as his older brother Conrad. We know that Adam's always been explicit about his favoritism towards Conrad, but it's interesting how Susanna also treats the boys very differently as well. In these two painting scenes, when she's painting Conrad versus when she's painting Jeremiah, she speaks to Conrad with much more emotional depth. She's curious about him, she wonders about what's going on in his mind, and almost even like pushes him a little bit too hard. Versus with Jeremiah, I mean, she's barely coherent, she's definitely high, and she takes on this like, oh, my sweet boy who could never do anything wrong and never has to change, never has to grow, that type of vibe. And to Susanna's defense, I don't think she's doing anything explicitly wrong, but I do think that she babies him in a way that is not necessarily helpful for his development or growth as a person. And with Adam, I'm just gonna put in these clips.
I'll pay you back.
How? You gonna pick up some extra lifeguard shifts at the club?
Internship, it means a lot.
Well, now that you're gonna be a husband, lifeguarding probably wasn't gonna cut it. Let's not forget Jeremiah, our super senior.
Don't get me wrong, I definitely think that Jeremiah had a lot to learn about responsibility and how to take care of himself, but there's definitely a way to correct your child without putting them down the way that Adam does. I feel like this scene was so impactful because it really shows how much Jeremiah took to heart what Adam said to him all those years and really internalized and believed those things about himself too.
You acted like I was the biggest moron on earth. And then when I told you I was calling off the wedding, you assumed I screwed something up because that's what I do.
I never said that.
You never said that to my face.
And honestly, I think the best thing that Adam did for the relationship was cutting Jeremiah off, because that was really when Jeremiah was able to finally stand on his own 2 feet and believe, like, I have to do this on my own now and have to figure out a way to be responsible, to be like an adult now and learn and grow. And he found his own footing without feeling like the pressure that he has to please his dad or get his approval because, he's financially dependent on him. So that brings me to the whole Cabo and cheating scandal. We don't ever get to see Jeremiah or Belly's relationship in college, but my guess is that he probably never got over the fact that Conrad was her first love and that he never felt like he could live up to Conrad's standard. So, keeping in mind this self fulfilling prophecy that Jeremiah has a negative view of self and that Belly likely doesn't take him as seriously as she takes Conrad, I think a part of Jeremiah panicked when he found out that Belly and Conrad were at Christmas together. And then when they have this huge fight about Cabo, he's thinking, oh no, our relationship is ending, and she's definitely running back to Conrad as soon as this is over. And don't get it twisted, I am in no way condoning cheating or however you want to define what Jeremiah did, but this is just to display how one's negative view of self can really lead to destructive behaviors that hurts themselves and other people in the process of that. So I think that Conrad's pattern of behavior is also caused by the self-fulfilling prophecy, but just manifests itself in a different way. He carries this label of being the responsible one, the perfect child, the one who, is super independent, never messes up. And you can see how these narratives that are constantly pushed onto him end up pushing him over to the edge, with his panic attack, having uncontrollable anxiety that he experiences, and shutting himself out from other people that he really cares about and needs in those moments.
Goddamn thing is infected, and I didn't notice. It's everywhere, and I didn't notice.
Conrad, whoa. Whoa. What is going on, man?
My heart's beating really fast, and,
As a therapist, I've seen time and time again how perfectionism at an early age creates an environment where people are regularly disconnected from their wants and needs. This is because they are oftentimes so focused on pleasing their parents and other people around them that they forget to turn inwards and focus on what they want. The problem oftentimes comes when the children associate their ability to please and perform with the ability to be loved. I think that Conrad believed that in the messiness of his grief that he wasn't good enough to be a partner for Belly, when in reality, partnership oftentimes means supporting each other through the messiness of life and being willing to show your vulnerabilities to other people. In his teen years, I don't think he was quite ready to expose those vulnerabilities yet, and it's really not until he goes to therapy and starts learning how to be more open with people that he was really able to be all in with Belly. And I also think that this kind of ties into his whole attachment style, which I might do a video on it in the future. So subscribe if you want to hear a little bit more about that. So an interesting piece of research that I found was that older siblings actually tend to be favored by their parents. Older siblings tend to be more conscientious, they tend to be more agreeable, organized, responsible, goal-directed, all the things that Conrad is. And I think that from a really early age, both Susanna and Adam kind of put that expectation on Conrad to be this perfect child, to be almost the caretaker of the kids. If you're an eldest sibling yourself, maybe you might even relate to this unfair expectation or pressure of having to be perfect or a good role model for younger siblings. And I think this hyper independence is ultimately what led Conrad to push Belly and everyone that he cares about away from him, especially during the times when he actually needed people the most. And what comes to mind when I think about this dynamic was when Conrad left college to prevent the beach house from being sold. He could have easily called Jeremiah to handle the situation together, but he was so dead set on protecting Jeremiah and everyone else around him that he was willing to sacrifice school and his education for it.
Seeing that sign was like losing her all over again, and I didn't want that for Chair.
Oh.
I didn't mean to worry anybody. I'm handling things. You guys can go.
You really see this like over responsible sibling dynamic kind of come through when Susanna tells Conrad on her deathbed that he has to promise to take care of Jeremiah.
I'm not scared because I know you'll be okay. And I know Jeremiah's gonna be okay too because he has you.
You know, I think that at face value, it feels like Susanna was trying to encourage Conrad in her own way, but the underlying message of that is basically telling Conrad that he is and has to remain strong through a challenge, especially at that age, that no one should have had to remain strong through. And on top of that, he's responsible for making sure that his younger brother is okay too. I think Susanna's approach of putting blinders on all the difficult things going on was always a big part of the problem. I know Susanna was likely going through her own wave of emotions, accepting her own death, but Conrad should have been allowed to be a kid and grieve his mom without having to worry about putting on a facade of everything being okay. And it definitely wasn't confirmed until season 3. Like, I had my speculations, but that conversation is ultimately, I think, what led Conrad to distance himself from Belly and to take a step back when he noticed that Belly and Jeremiah were starting something. He was thinking, they probably need each other in this moment, and I can take care of myself. I've always been able to take care of myself. Let me just be on my own. So I think Conrad's self-fulfilling prophecy is that he's only good enough when he's perfect. And, you know, given that he was grieving his mom, he believed that he wasn't good enough to be with Belly at that point, which led him to be cold and distant from her when he was grieving his mom, which then led Belly to be really confused, to be really hurt, which then led her to kind of like lash out at him and break up with him, which then confirms to him, I was never good enough. You know, I think being independent and being self-sufficient is a good thing in moderation. You know, just like how being carefree and being like the fun one can be good in moderation. But I think that this ultimately led Conrad to be really lonely in his experience of grief. But I was so happy to see kind of like this character growth at the end of the season where he has this really vulnerable conversation with Steven about how he's been feeling.
Glad he has you. I just miss you too. I miss Jer. Even before all this stuff, I miss the three of us.
And honestly, even though Steven kind of brushed it off and didn't really address what Conrad was actually saying, I was really proud of Conrad because that was the first time where I think that he was actually able to be vulnerable with someone. He's finally inviting someone into his process of vulnerability and like this imperfect, weird space of grieving. But I do want to talk about a way in which I see sibling rivalry or sibling conflict manifest itself in a maybe healthier way. Right? I think Belly and Steven's relationship is a pretty good example of this. Their relationship is not perfect by any means, but I think that they have a healthy way of kind of like navigating through conflict and misunderstanding of each other. And ultimately, at the end of every conversation, I think they are able to kind of like understand each other a little bit better. And I think this is all in the way that Laurel parents them. I think even early on in the books, Belly talks about how Laurel hates when Belly tattles on Steven and whatnot. And I think that's really just like Laurel's way of letting the kids know, like, look, I'll step in when it feels really important to, but otherwise, you guys should hash things out on your own and you guys should kind of like learn to navigate through conflict. Okay, I know that was a handful of information to take in, but let me know in the comments if, you know, you relate to any of the things I shared about, whether you feel like maybe you're more of a Conrad or maybe more of a Jeremiah. I promise I won't judge you or label you as a villain if you feel like you relate more to Jeremiah. But yeah, let me know what you think in the comments and subscribe if you want to see more content like this.